You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 517 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have a lot of big news to cover, including Roger Stone getting his sentence commuted by Donald Trump. Going to talk about the dysfunction in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. continuing to support weapons makers in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You do that at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the show and the roundup are on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. The other thing you could do is to help support the show, cover the cost and everything by donating to it at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up on today's show is Trump commuting Roger Stone's sentence. This, really got sucked into the whole Russiagate narrative. And I think even by the official Russiagate, Russia hacked the emails and passed them to WikiLeaks story, Roger Stone may or may not have actually done anything by the official narrative. It seems that he actually wrapped himself up in all of this by his own lies. So he ends up being a convicted felon. I believe 7 charges dealing with a range from witness tampering, which it seems very obvious he did, to lying to investigators, and these seem to be some dubious charges and convictions. He's sentenced to 40 months in prison. Now, a major problem with this trial is that Roger Stone was given a gag order. It was pretty clear that what was being done in the case was not necessarily the biggest miscarriage of justice as far as the U.S. system goes. Like, I understand we could point out like 50 other things that are definitely worse, but overall, an unfair thing. And he was gagged by the judge and denied his First Amendment rights. Now, one of the things that he did that was a definite mistake is the witness tampering. Seems to at least be something that happened where he did call somebody who was going to be a witness in his trial and threatened that witness, and I believe threatened his dog. Now, I've heard the guy who was threatened, Randy, I forget his last name, it starts with a C, and he's kind of said that he didn't take it seriously, and I guess, maybe felt that Roger Stone was guilty but shouldn't face jail time for this. I don't want to summarize what he said too much, but he essentially downplayed it. He wasn't saying that I felt my life was in jeopardy. Roger Stone's I don't know, he may have said the guy was nuts, but not like in a way that he's a homicidal maniac. So anyways, that's kind of Roger Stone. Now, again, the reason I talk about it on the show is he's wrapped up somehow in this whole Russiagate thing, again, mostly by his own lies. And so Donald Trump commuting the sentence of Roger Stone is, I think, going to just take this up a whole nother level. It's going to be one more in the list of things that, especially the real true blue Democrats, blue no matter who people who are just mindlessly tweeting that, Donald Trump supported a foreign power against U.S. troops and, rigged the election with Vladimir Putin, and still believe that that's the absolute thing that happened in 2016. This is just going to be another thing for them, I think, to hit Trump on. The optics of it for Trump probably aren't great to people outside of his base. At the same time, this, I think, comparable crimes like what Petraeus did as far as giving top, clearance information to his mistress, or Hillary Clinton's secret email server where she refused to ever return those 30,000 missing emails, are probably a little bit bigger crimes than this and, deserve more jail time. At the same time, if, the 3 of them want to share a jail cell, I'm not going to shed too many tears for it. So I just want to weigh in that much because I think, again, it's going to be used to promote the Russiagate narrative, and mostly it's unrelated. It's not actually anything that has to do with the real substance and, the temples and the claims of Russiagate, more just political performer in Roger Stone, who was loosely tied, especially in the early part of the Trump administration, and, to the network of I guess, alternative media that exists, loosely and then connected to Julian Assange that way. Ends up, making a big name for himself through all this, but generally probably didn't help the country very much with his lies. All right, moving on from Roger Stone, because I really think that's one of the more inconsequential things going on. Nonetheless, it's definitely the top trending thing on Twitter here. And again, this Russiagate narrative is just so destructive. I'm seeing everybody still mindlessly repeating this Afghan, bounty story that, has been shown time and time again to be bunk. In fact, I just watched this really good interview of Gareth Porter by Anya Parampil on the Gray Zone YouTube channel. I also think Scott Horton interviewed, and there'll be an episode of the Scott Horton show this week with Gareth Porter on this Russian bounty story that I'm sure will be absolutely fantastic. And so keep an eye on that. But this thing is pretty much now debunked and shown to be inflated Afghan intelligence that they likely got out of torturing some captured Taliban members. A couple things on the home front here that I think are important. There's this interesting story in the Intercept that I'll link to in the show notes page. And it's about bail reform and how basically all the bail reform that's happened in the past few years is, using algorithms and matrices. And the idea is that this is going to produce a less biased bail system. But it turns out that that's really not what's happening. Is kind of the fundamental problem with government and why, you can't price control and, do Marxist control of the markets, because, if you don't know what prices are and what people desire, then all of your data is junk in and junk out. And so, they produce findings that essentially, within these algorithms or matrices or whatever, where, they look at like 5 or 10 factors. Oh, this is a male, age 24. He has, 2 priors, but no felonies. I'm sure, status as a student or, having an address. And, then they look at this and it calculates and it's like, you got a score of 10. And so that means, you're high risk to jump bail. So you're going to get a high bail, or you're low risk. And so you'll be let go. And so, it kind of finds that the people who would be able to make bail, so kids, like under 20 something, and you're a white kid, especially middle class background, or if you're a black kid with a middle class background, your parents are going to be able to, have the contents, to scrape together $10,000 or $15,000 to throw up as bail. Your parents own a home. In a lot of places that could be leveraged for bail money. And so, if you're from the middle class background, you're not going to, be locked in jail for years on end, be a Khalif Browder story because of the bail system. But if you're, poorer, then you're likely to have that. And so you don't have, these, what they would say are ties that would make it so you're less of a risk, and then are likely to get a higher, bail price that you can't, pay for. Well, one of the reasons that this is important is, let's say you're in jail for something, small time burglary, no weapon involved. You went in, you stole a couple $100 worth of whatever from electronics from a store, maybe $1,500 or so. It's a bigger deal, or something, $500 in some states, whatever. Even if it's something that you're looking at doing like 6 months for, if you want to go to trial, it's going to cost you some money, or you're going to have a incompetent public defender, but it's going to take a year or so. And so if you can't get out on bail, then you're actually going to do more time trying to fight it than you would if you had just, pled guilty. And so you end up with a lot of guilty pleas. This definitely makes it so that the incentive of the system is to keep people in jail on bail. Because, if you force people to sign the guilty plea, it's going to, by some metrics, it's going to free up the court resources, because if you don't go to trial, of course, these are people that should be able to go and fight for themselves, because these prior convictions are things that add up that say, hey, now next time you're going to have a higher bail, and also, hurt your chances of getting an apartment, getting a house, getting a job. And so, these systems are real destructive. And we've had this bail reform in the past couple of years, and it was supposed to make things better, and it's just not happening. Police agencies are continuing to use this company Dataminer, DATAMINR, all one word there. And I guess this company has special ties to Twitter. And so, with their kind of backdoor pipeline deal or whatever, they do a relatively effective job of being able to like sort through what's going on the platform. And then they, tell police, hey, there's an organization happening here. People are tweeting about this video here. And I really don't think that's a service that police should have, and certainly something, that we should have a discussion about. Also, talking about as far as the Black Lives Matter movement goes, and you have all these corporations, doing the blackout or whatever on their Twitter page and tweeting out Black Lives Matter or, rainbow flags and in some way virtue signaling, but at the same time, helping police crack down on the protests against this seems, pretty hypocritical. And so there's a couple different angles to look at this from, but it's definitely anti-liberty. Learned a couple things in this VOTS article that I'll link to in the show notes page. It is the U.S. Army maintains a Twitch page. I've never actually used Twitch before other than to monitor some of the Black Lives Matter protests. So I'm not sure, what the gaming portion of that platform looks like, but they apparently have an esports team where they play Call of Duty. Now, there's some propaganda issues here that I could talk about, but to get more into this particular story, I guess some users who were on the page, I'm not sure, again, how Twitch works, but were able to like post questions or somehow like comment on the U.S. Army's performance, asking about the My Lai massacre and the Kunduz hospital bombing from 2015. These are two instances of clear U.S. war crimes where relatively nobody was held responsible, especially in the Kunduz hospital bombing. And, it just produced tons of foreign victims and absolutely a horrific situation. Well, the U.S. Army just responded by banning people from this channel. I think one interesting thing, to think about, and again, we don't have to do a whole discussion about this on the show, but, this idea of if you are like public, a police department, the army, the president, can you ban people on, your social media platforms? Is it that, because you are a public figure and, your word, it has to deal with everyone in the public for that reason that, you really shouldn't be allowed to ban people from your platform? Maybe it enters into a lot more the public square arena once, you're actually talking about public officials using these platforms. And also just good that it seems like the younger generation understands that the U.S. government isn't, the great thing it's meant out to be. And when they're trying to use this platform as propaganda, the users fight back and point out how, hey, we're like glorifying these army guys, playing with guns in the games, but when they do this in real life, they kill civilians. A super PAC with connections to John Bolton is targeting Republican Eric Brakey in Maine. I actually met this guy a couple years ago at a Ron Paul YAL event, not too far from where I live. He was a great guy, very nice. We didn't talk for very long, so I can't vouch, for how well he understands these war issues, but I have seen him speak some and kind of keep an eye on what he was doing. He was running for Senate back then, I think, and now he's running for a House seat in Maine and doing pretty well in the polls, well enough that this super PAC is actually spending $340,000 on his challenger to try to intervene. It seems like a lot of this is actually built around the war issue. This is another article from the Intercept, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. But what goes through is that a lot of this is built around the war issue. Brakey is a guy that wants to bring troops home. I don't know if he's going to be quite as good as Thomas Massie on these issues, but he's definitely better than Matt Gaetz and just as good as Rand Paul. So if we do get him into the House, it'll be another powerful voice. As we know, we are losing Tulsi Gabbard, in the House coming up in the next year. And so the gain other anti-war voices in there is critical. So a part of the COVID bailouts were, I guess, the small business loans. There's a very good interview by Scott Horton of Grant Smith, and he details how there's a lot of these kind of Israeli connected either companies or advocacy groups that received bailout money in these latest COVID bailouts. And so it seems pretty absurd that they would take advantage and Scott and Grant do a great job of breaking it down. I know a lot of listeners to this show just listen to Scott's podcast, so I'm going to not detail that all the way and just let you guys listen to that episode. I'll link to it in the show notes page. But just know that our tax dollars and, as the rest of us regular Americans, what I've gotten, and fortunately I haven't been, kicked out of my job and lost my salary like some people have and their income and everything. But $1,200 is, what some people who have been by government mandate unable to work, that's all they've gotten from the government. And yet, they go through these companies and groups getting hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars. It's quite absurd. There's a group of senators working to insert a provision into the 2021 NDAA that will create an office of joint cyber planning. It looks like, the intent of this office, they say, is to monitor things like the fake Russiagate hoax. So who knows what it's actually going to do, but it's likely that in the coming years, we'll maybe see an intelligence report from this agency saying Iran, Venezuela, Russia, China carried out these attempted hacks against the U.S. government. Now, again, this is a time where government economies in a recession, possibly a depression, a lot of people, tens of millions of people out of work. We're going to now drop $15 million on this new part of the defense agency. And my guess is since it's more spending, this will probably make it into the bill and make it into ultimately existence, this Office of Joint Cyber Planning. There's a great article from Responsible Statecraft by Mark Perry. I'll link to it in the show notes page. He basically explains why the Navy isn't working. Of course, he does it much more eloquently than that, but he goes over kind of the major milestones and what's happened in the Navy over the past, I think he goes 40 years, and just kind of details how time and time again there's mistakes of either immorality or incompetence, the sexual abuse of female sailors, having all these ships run aground in the South China Sea, collisions, with civilian vessels, stuff like that. I detail on the show all the time the flaws of, the major Navy spending projects, the USS Reagan class of aircraft carriers that have at least one fatal flaw. They can't use the lift elevators to get the planes above and below deck, so makes the planes somewhat more ineffective if you can't, take them off and then get them below deck to get them restocked and everything, then back above. And then the USS Zumwalt class of destroyers lack a main weapon still, and I guess not knowing what to do with these very expensive multi-billion-dollar ships, the government's now looking at strapping hypersonic missiles on them. So lots of problems with the U.S. Navy. Mark Perry, again, it then goes back to, in his story, detailing the fallout from the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and then explains that there's people in the Navy that know this problem. One great thing about Mark Perry is he knows people within and around the Pentagon, and they talk to him and they say, hey, this is what's going on with our branch and this is the problems with it. And so that's stuff's very important and, great information for the rest of us. One of the conclusions of the article is essentially that there's really not enough sailors to maintain the ships and the rotations and do all the missions that they're expected to do. And so now with the Trump, push to add more sailors, it's just going to exacerbate this problem by a lot. And it's a really great article by Mark Perry. I will link to the show notes page again so everybody can read it who wants to. But, he basically summarized why the U.S. Navy isn't working. The U.S. Air Force is looking to award a $10 million contract to somebody who can develop a flying car. More wasted money. The State Department approved the sale of 105 F-35s to Japan. The sale is going to net Lockheed Martin $23 billion. So this is, a huge boon to them. It doesn't really help the rest of us at all, even though Trump will tout, oh, we sell all these weapons, that's great for the economy. It's really not doing anything to help us at this point. The U.S. also approved a $620 million weapons upgrade for the Patriot missile systems in Taiwan. I mentioned these two weapon sales together because I think China is going to interpret them as hawkish towards them. Japan and Taiwan are, geopolitical rivals of China, and both allied and supported by the United States. So, China, I think, is going to look at this as the greater U.S. policy. The U.S. is trying to wrap China into arms negotiations right now. And China's response is saying that, hey, look, you're obviously not serious about this, so we're not going to negotiate. And maybe a lot of Americans wouldn't understand that, but it's pretty clear from, these kind of moves that, yeah, the U.S. isn't interested in de-escalating military tensions with China when we're selling weapons to countries that, China sees as like geopolitical peers or threats or, strategic adversaries. I don't know how they would phrase it, especially in the case of Japan. But at the same time, that's the way they're going to interpret this, especially when, we right now have 2 American aircraft carriers sailing around in the South China Sea. So I guess maybe European Command sometimes feels left out because Pacific Command, is getting so much, kind of military Cold War, build up with China. But don't worry, it's going on in Estonia as well, as the U.S. is deploying Reaper drones to Estonia for the first time. They could strap bombs to these things, and, we don't need to be doing this on Russia's border. Continue to build up a NATO, and I'm sure will be an issue in the months and years to come, as hopefully one day we have a president who's actually interested in escalating tensions with Russia. All right, last story I have today is a article from the National Interest by Matthew Petty, or Petty, I'm not sure. He does good work over there. This one was about the U.S. backing the Mali and Burkina Faso militaries. I've talked on the show a lot about how there's all this violence going on between different ethnic groups in the military, and how, jihadists and spillover from Libya has exacerbated these problems. But, the U.S. support for the militaries, and it's looking like the militaries have increasingly committed war crimes against civilian populations, mass murders of hundreds of people. And, if this is happening, the U.S. needs to, of course, back off their support. And it's the reason we shouldn't be supporting these militaries in the first place. And yeah, it's likely to continue and potentially fuel blowback terrorism against the U.S. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up for today. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. I know I usually have Will Porter with me on Mondays. Hopefully I will have him on later in the week. Busy week for myself and Will, so we will try to make that happen though. Hope everybody is enjoying the show. Share it at from the Libertarian Institute at KYAAALE on Twitter.